We have discussed earlier that the stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped by the ventricles per beat, and it mainly depends on end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. And we get its formula if we subtract end systolic volume from end diastolic volume. We know that from the whole body through vein, via superior and inferior vena cava into the right atrium, and also from lungs through pulmonary veins into the left atrium. Blood enters the heart, and then from atria, it moves to ventricles during ventricular diastole or relaxation phase. So the volume at the end of that ventricular diastole, or just before the systole, is the end diastolic volume. And after contraction of ventricles or systole, as not 100% blood is pumped out. So the volume left at the end of systole is the end systolic volume. So if we subtract the volume left, that is ESV, from the total volume, EDV, we will get the stroke volume. So here, if we add value of end diastolic volume 120 milliliters and ESV as 50 milliliters, we will get 70 milliliters stroke volume per beat. This stroke volume is dependent on, or we can say factors that affect stroke volume are preload, force of contraction, and afterload. Starting with preload, as we know, pre means before entering the heart, and load here comes from incoming volume of blood. And this preload of the heart can be defined as the stretch of myocardium or end diastolic volume of the ventricles. Most frequently, preload refers to the volume in a ventricle just before the start of systole. So, two words that best describes preload are stretch and EDV. Generally, this preload is determined by the end diastolic volume. More the end diastolic volume, more will be the preload. And this preload is mainly affected by venous return and filling time of the ventricles, where the venous return is the amount of blood which is returned to heart from different parts of the body through veins. When this venous return increases, the ventricular filling increases, and so increase the end diastolic volume. More the EDV, more will be the preload. Thus more will be the stroke volume, and ultimately the cardiac output is increased. Thus, cardiac output is directly proportional to venous return, provided the other factors, like force of contraction, heart rate, and peripheral resistance, remain constant. This venous return in turn depends upon 5 factors, that are respiratory pump, muscle pump, gravity, venous pressure, and sympathetic tone. Here, the respiratory pump is actually the respiratory activity that helps the return of blood to heart during inspiration. It is also called abdominothoracic pump. Let me explain how it works. We know that during inspiration, thoracic cavity expands and the abdominal cavity shrinks. So when it happens, the pressure in the thoracic cavity will decrease, but in abdominal cavity, the pressure will be very high. And to overcome this increase in the intra-abdominal pressure, abdominal veins compresses and pushes the blood upward towards the heart. As blood moves from high-pressure abdominal cavity to the low-pressure thoracic cavity, acting as a pump, and thereby the venous return is increased. That's why it is called the respiratory pump or abdominothoracic pump. This respiratory pump is much stronger in forced respiration and in severe muscular exercise. Next important factor affecting venous return is muscle pump. Muscle pump is actually the muscular activity that helps in return of the blood to the heart. During muscular activities, the veins are compressed or squeezed. Due to the presence of valves in veins, during compression the blood is moved towards the heart. So, when muscular activity increases, the venous return is more. Let's see how it works. When the skeletal muscles contract, the vein located in between the muscles is compressed. Valve of the vein proximal to the contracting muscles is opened and the blood is propelled towards the heart, while the valve of the vein distal to the muscles is closed by the backflow of blood. On the other hand, during relaxation of the muscles, the valve proximal to muscles closes and prevents the backflow of blood, while the valve distal to the muscles opens and allows the blood to flow upwards. Next factor is gravity. Gravitational force reduces the venous return. When a person stands for a long period, gravity causes pooling of blood in the legs, which is called venous pooling. Because of venous pooling, the amount of blood returning to heart decreases. That means gravity has negative effect on venous return and thus on stroke volume. Next factor is venous pressure. Venous pressure also affects the venous return. We know fluid moves from high pressure to low pressure. And as the diameter increases, pressure decreases. So the pressure in the venules with small diameter is high, that is 12 to 18 millimeters of mercury. From the smaller to the larger veins, the pressure gradually decreases. And so, in the great veins, that is the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava, the pressure falls to about 5.5 millimeters of mercury. And even at the junction of venae cavae and right atrium, it is about 4.6 millimeters of mercury. And pressure in the right atrium is still low, and it alters during cardiac action, that it even falls to 0 during atrial diastole. So this pressure gradient at every part of venous tree helps as a driving force for venous return. And so, this venous pressure seriously affects the venous return. Another important factor that affects venous return is the sympathetic tone. Venous return is aided by sympathetic or vasomotor tone as well. This sympathetic activation or stimulation causes vasoconstriction, but the main constriction that affects venous return is definitely of veins. That is termed as venoconstriction. So more the venoconstriction, more it will pushes the blood towards heart, and thus more will be the venous return. So all these factors that increases venous return ultimately increases EDV and thus preload, thus increasing the stroke volume and ultimately the cardiac output. Other than venous return, another factor that affects preload is the filling time of the ventricles. Each chamber of the heart requires proper time for the filling of blood, and so it is an important factor that affects the preload, and then ultimately cardiac output. The longer the filling time, the greater the EDV, and so greater the preload. Now, other than preload, an important factor that affects the stroke volume is the force of contraction. Just now, we have discussed the preload, and this preload has very direct impact on the force of contraction of the cardiac muscles. This relation between the stretch or preload and the contractility of the cardiac myocytes is well explained by Frank Starling's law that we are going to learn in this next section.
Explore our extensive library of over 1,800 video lectures to learn about a wide range of topics. Only on sqadia.com.